This is the FYI on Youth Ministry, a podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute. Today's guest is Dr. David Wang. David is here to talk with us about trauma-informed youth ministry. But first, let's hear from some youth leaders about today's topic.
Do you have any questions that come up for you when you think about trauma that leaders experience or that young people experience?
I've known people that they've gone through trauma, something bad has happened, and they wonder, where is God? But not just that, how does my faith affect how I feel right now? Should I feel this trauma if I'm a good Christian? I feel this anger towards people, but also towards God. And I did a lot of listening, but sometimes it's hard to really say, the right thing. So I guess that would be the biggest question.
Our church had lost, I think it was an 8-year-old back in 2017 because of a drive-by shooting. And so recognizing that our youth have different levels of proximity to that trauma and other traumas, even if I personally wasn't super close to the big traumatic incident at our church, that said, it still affects me. At that point in time, we talked about circles of trauma and how there's different experiences at each circle and its distance to the center of that traumatic event.
I think if there is a topic or a current event that's going on in the world that I know is going to get brought up and might trigger someone, I might reach out to their family, given that I have knowledge. That's not always a certainty that I do have knowledge of someone's trauma or their own life experience that they're still working through. But if I do have knowledge of it, I try and give a quick little hint to their family saying, hey, this might come up tonight, and I just want you to be able to share with your student, hey, y'all are planning on talking about this tonight, and fill in the blank.
Hello everyone, my name is Giovanny Panginda.
This is Roslyn Hernández. In today's episode, we are going to talk to Dr. David Wang. We're going to talk about trauma and how trauma-informed ministry is so important for us as youth leaders. Thank you so much for being with us.
Super grateful to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, so Dave has worked on a resource that was published by the Urban Youth Workers Institute. And if you're familiar with them, you might know them as UYWI. The resource is called SCARS. And SCARS is a psychologically and theologically informed resource that is developed to equip youth workers to disciple youth who have endured harsh circumstances. Again, this is amazing. I'm so excited that we get to share with this with all our listeners.
And David does it all. He is not only a girl dad, he has 2 daughters.
Yes.
But he's also the pastor of spiritual formation at One Life Church City in Fullerton, California. And he's a licensed psychologist, and he's an assistant professor of psychology at Biola University. So welcome, Dave.
So good to be here.
And this might be breaking news. He will be joining the Fuller family in the fall.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll be doing a lot of this work at Fuller. My new role is the Cliff and Joyce Penner Chair for the formation of emotionally healthy leaders. So the work that y'all are doing, the work that we're doing with UYWI, it's really at the center of what I'll be doing at Fuller. And I'm super excited for that new season of life in ministry.
Yes, we're also so excited to have you with us. Well, there's so many exciting things about Dave, but one of the things that I find most exciting is the fact that, as Jim mentioned, you're a girl dad. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that's like for you?
Yeah, sure. It's super fun. My wife gave birth to both of our girls when I was in graduate school, which is not something I
Oh.
recommend. Our older daughter was born when I was in seminary, and my younger daughter was born when I was in graduate school studying clinical psychology. So we were really stressed out for those first early years, I remember. I know it's really stressful to have little kids. And that at the same time of grad school and all this other stuff, it was quite a journey. And I'm just very grateful for both of them and the ways that they ground me, and the ways that, especially now that they're older, they're teenagers now, they actually accompany me as much as I accompany them now.
Yes. Well, why don't we jump into the episode? I'm so grateful that we get to share this kind of information. There's been words like trauma and triggered that are terms that we often hear in popular culture and social media. In the public square, words tend to be misconstrued or gain other meanings. So in the context of psychology and for this episode, what is trauma?
Great question. Well, a good place to start is the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. According to the DSM, a traumatic event is an event in which a person has either experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or others. And the important thing that I want to highlight here, and we'll talk about this later on in today's episode, is that a trauma exposure can either be direct, as in you're the person who is experiencing that trauma, you're in that event yourself, or trauma exposure could also be indirect. That is, you may not be in the event itself, rather you can be a witness to it, or you may have heard about it. So you can be confronted with the trauma indirectly. And you know what? Both of those forms of exposure to trauma are potentially traumatic events. Right? And we're going to highlight that a lot more in the future, but there's lots of different kinds of traumas in real life. We have natural disasters, we have global pandemics, something that we're all familiar with, motor vehicle accidents, sexual assault, childhood trauma, combat trauma, domestic violence, and trauma can show up in many different forms and frequencies in one's life. For example, we can have acute trauma where there's a single traumatic event that just lasts for a limited amount of time, like maybe a car accident where there's like a clear start date and end date. You can have chronic trauma where you have multiple traumatic events that happen over an extended period of time. I know a lot of people at my church and a lot of friends and colleagues who grew up in poverty or grew up in neighborhoods with perpetual violence. Their experience fits the chronic trauma experience, where you can't just pinpoint one specific trauma, but it just feels like throughout one's entire childhood, it was just event after event after event. And then last, there's also complex trauma, where you're dealing with trauma that's caused by someone that the survival actually knows and depends on for survival and safety. So in those cases where childhood trauma, for example, involves a perpetrator or where the perpetrator is a family member, where you actually have a relationship with the one who instigates the trauma, that's called complex trauma. So trauma unfortunately shows up in many different forms and fashions in one's life.
Wow, it's so good to know. And why would it be important for us as youth leaders? And how can being aware of trauma be helpful to us?
Great question. And I think the first place to start is this hope that if we can understand trauma and understand some of the ways that it impacts people, that we can be better able to communicate with and also support those who have been affected by trauma. And when we think of those who have been affected by trauma, it's almost all of us. The World Health Organization has found through their research that over 70% of people in the entire world have been exposed to some kind of traumatic event in their lifetime. And on average, people are dealing with around 4 or 5 traumatic events per person. So it's not just one single trauma. Trauma oftentimes comes up in bunches. And in fact, one study reported that upwards of 90% of people, and these are individuals living in lower income urban areas throughout the United States, that 90% of individuals in those contexts have experienced trauma sometimes sometime in their life. So if we were just walking down the street and we were to encounter a stranger and not know their story, statistics would suggest that if we were to venture to guess whether or not they've experienced a traumatic event, that we should always assume the answer yes. A lot of schools, a lot of universities, a lot of hospitals, lots of other contexts are just now beginning to explore the implications of this on the entire system, on the culture of an organization, if we were to take seriously this reality that most of the people that walk into our doors actually have some hidden traumatic event in their history that they just haven't shared, that we don't know yet. And what I'm hoping through our conversation today and through these resources that we're going to share about is that more and more churches and youth ministries can start exploring this possibility as well, that, how can we as a youth ministry do things differently if we were to take seriously this reality that most of the youth coming into our door probably have some either historical or ongoing trauma in their lives.
Yeah, thank you.
You mentioned there are so many aspects and ways of experiencing trauma.
Right.
And something that I've heard about is secondary or vicarious trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And that whenever I think of youth leaders or aid workers, because as youth leaders, we are empathizing with our students. And
right.
whenever they have gone through something traumatic, it kind of hits us in a way where we're really empathizing with them. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And like you mentioned, there is a burgeoning research literature on that topic you mentioned, on secondary trauma and on vicarious trauma. And the idea behind secondary trauma is, again, remembering, going back to the definition of trauma, that a trauma exposure could either be a direct exposure, where I'm experiencing this myself, or an indirect exposure where I'm actually not in that situation, but I'm walking with people who have been. And I'm indirectly confronted with this, with other people's stories, and I'm witnessing their stories. And what secondary trauma tells us is that those who have, even if we've never experienced a traumatic event in our own lives, for us to walk with others who have, that actually is a trauma exposure for us potentially. And just as trauma survivors might go on to develop all these different symptoms of traumatic stress or, of PTSD, we as youth workers and as Christian leaders, we can develop those same symptoms through our work with youth and other populations that have survived trauma. So one of the important implications of our conversation is we need to take seriously the care of youth ministry workers as well as the youth.
Yeah, it's so helpful to get clear explanations of trauma from a psychological perspective. And, I want to move towards the application and integration part in youth ministry. For me, I relate to it so much just because while I was early on in doing youth ministry, I experienced my own trauma. If you are a longtime listener, a lot of people have know about the death of my sister at a church event. She drowned saving another kid. I couldn't get to her in time, and I remember just the hurt from that. At least the first year or two of youth ministry, because of hurt people. Yeah. I either used my sister's death as an emotional manipulation to sometimes this fear that I had to protect all my students from everything and anything, and it became so just irrational. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think it's so important for youth leaders to be informed about their own personal trauma, in order to do their work justly, as well as it's just so important. So why do youth workers need to be informed about personal trauma, their own trauma, or the trauma of someone close that they might have experienced? How does this inform youth ministry?
Yeah, great question. And thank you for sharing that, Gio. And I think the implications of this is, we have to take trauma seriously if we want youth workers to thrive, to be emotionally healthy, and to have longevity in their vocation. Mental health and mental struggles is one of the leading causes for Christian leaders of all sorts to to leave their positions prematurely. You know? And when I think of reflect on some of the observations that you shared from your own life, those are all very common trauma symptoms. You know, and I think when we really think about things critically through the lens of trauma, there's so many potential symptoms that are actually tied directly to traumatic stress. You know, so you see youth or youth workers experiencing symptoms like anger or sadness or anxiety or burnout, or when people become socially isolated, when they start numbing their emotions away, even bodily symptoms or problems with sleep. There's actually a good chance that all of them or some of them are actually directly tied to traumatic stress. You know, that if we were to go into the root of this issue, that it has to do with some trauma that a person is in the middle of dealing with. And in fact, I don't know if I really hope someone's going to do research on this, and it might have to be us at Fuller when I start my position. But someone needs to do some more wide-scale research on the impact and prevalence of trauma among Christian leaders, because just from anecdotal evidence, when I interact with Christian leaders, we do lots of trainings with different youth leaders around the country on trauma. And what brings them into our training is their interest to help trauma survivors among their youth groups. But when we actually start having the conversation, that conversation always starts shifting to themselves, you know, and I hear so many stories, not only of people having their surviving their own trauma, but their trauma actually being the pathway into their ministry calling. You know, that people, through their own suffering and through their own pain, they come to a calling to serve youth because they don't want the youth to suffer that kind of pain alone, like they had to do in their life. So it actually directly informs for many even their calling into the ministry.
Yeah. Dave, have you been reading my journal? Is that what's going on here? Because no, truly, like I totally agree with that. And if anything, the death of my sister was like a catalyst of me wanting to serve high schoolers and people her age group. And if anything, it was very healing, for me as well. So thank you for saying that. And it only acknowledges that, yeah, I think I'm in the right path here, being a youth minister here.
Yeah. And we are all wounded healers. And I think some of the most effective and gifted youth leaders out there are those that are familiar with their own pain. It's just that we have to be careful because our own pain is a double-edged sword. It can be the source of our compassion, and it also can be a source of dishealth as well. There are some cases where other Christian leaders and youth leaders, because they haven't dealt with their trauma, even though their heart and their intention is to help youth, they might end up doing things that actually might cause more harm than good.
Yes.
This reminds me of something that we kind of touched upon a little bit in a previous episode when we talked to Dr. Kristen. And she mentioned something about post-traumatic growth. And I mean, to me, having that sense of purpose that comes from your trauma, when you've worked through things and you see that there's a meaning behind it, and it brings you to a point of wanting to do ministry with young people is a great example of that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that happens? It probably isn't as, it's probably just harder to come to after trauma, but can you touch a little bit more on it?
Sure thing. It's absolutely true that so many of us can grow through a trauma. And one of the ways we do that is we find meaning in life. We find meaning through our pain. Our traumatic experiences cause us to reflect on questions that we normally wouldn't have ever reflected on. And as a result, it might kind of change the direction and trajectory of our lives so that we can really live in a more, live a life that's worth living, a life that's truly meaningful. And when I think of a meaningful life, it's a life that's lived for others. It's not just for ourselves, and that's part of probably what Gio was talking about earlier in his own testimony of how his own pain led him to the ministry. And, at the same time, I feel like sometimes Christian communities will want to just skip straight to the post-traumatic growth Sometimes Christian communities are tempted to skip straight to the meaning making, and so a lot of what I do in my clinical practice and my teaching and my work on trauma, especially with Christian leaders, is to remind all of us that we're still human and we can't skip straight to meaning making. We have to go through the wilderness of grief first, right? Like, for example, when I think about forgiveness, in certain traumatic situations that involve other people doing hurtful things against us, a lot of times I believe Christians, we go into forgiveness way too early. We go into forgiveness even before someone has grieved the offense, right? And it's important for us to go through that grief first so that we can actually own and process and acknowledge all that has actually happened before we can finally begin to let go and forgive. And if we do it prematurely, we actually cheapen the process, and we end up with an outcome that may look like growth, but it lacks the substance of post-traumatic growth. Usually post-traumatic growth takes a while before we can attain. We can't jump straight to the redemptive narrative. And in many cases, in many situations involving trauma, we may not be able to skip to that redemptive, triumphal narrative until Christ returns.
I love that you said that, because at church, in order to kind of help with my students understand that grief is part of the process, we watched that Pixar movie. Do you know the movie I'm talking about?
Inside Out, was it? Or?
Exactly, yeah. Inside Out. And the reason why I share that is because I so often, see myself more as joy. Like so happy, and then there's sadness, and the sadness is, to me, the villain. It's like, come on, you're ruining everything, But no, like, we have to experience the sadness, and I share with my students that just like what you said, sadness is a part of the process. We have an entire book of Psalms, yes, which features all the different feelings, but sadness is definitely in there.
Absolutely.
And Lamentations too.
Yeah, I think of Psalms of Lamentations, right?
Yeah.
Like, we gotta let ourselves feel all the feels, however long it takes. And like, we have all these Psalms where it's like, it starts very dark, but by the end of the Psalm, it has come to a different place, and there's hope, and we come to this point of knowing that God is with us, and that God's family and the community, the church, is with us whenever we just let ourselves feel it all, and let people come alongside us and like hold us in that.
Absolutely. And thinking of that movie Inside Out, it's actually based on some really solid psychological research, which has found that regardless of what culture that we belong to throughout the world, that we all are hardwired to experience 5 different emotions. So the 5 different characters in Inside Out are those what we call primary emotions. It's part of being human. They're hardwired into our brain. And I would add, if we think about this theologically, that these are 5 emotions that God created all humans to experience. And because of that, all those emotions are holy, not just the positive ones.
Yeah. Amen.
On a related note, right, as we're talking about these feelings and letting ourselves feel it all, some of our listeners might be wondering, how can I help my students when I'm also experiencing difficulties, when I'm also healing from trauma, when I'm also going through something? So can you give us a couple of examples of things that youth leaders can do if they find themselves in that kind of situation?
Sure thing. And this is something that is so common among us youth leaders and Christian leaders. And I think the first place to start, and I'm guilty of this as well, is that we all have to check ourselves when it comes to having some sort of savior mentality with the youth and with the students that we work with. And for me, speaking as a licensed psychologist, speaking as, pastor, I catch myself oftentimes idealizing my role with the people that I work with, whether they're formal therapy clients or students or people in my congregation. And when I idealize myself, I see myself as the savior, the be all end all, that one person that can take up everyone's cross and heal them from all their traumas. And unfortunately, I've seen too many situations, including myself at times, where we take too much upon ourselves. And even though our intent was to help, we may actually end up doing some harm, or even more harm than good. So when we're finding ourselves experiencing our own difficulties, when we find ourselves still very much in our own process of healing from our own traumas, I think my encouragement to you all, and this goes to me too, is to accept our humanity. Like, we can't save anyone, can't even save ourselves. And that's okay, because that's what Jesus is here for, and as a result, we need to learn how to grieve and accept our own limitations. And that could be one of the most important lessons for us to learn as Christian leaders, right? And this lesson of grieving and accepting our limitations, it could be so liberating at the same time. It can free us to be fully ourselves, instead of kind of this false self that we want to portray, in public. And it helps ground us into our true selves, so that the gift that we give is actually the genuine gift of our own presence, rather than someone that we're trying to mold ourselves out of. And I found that in my work with trauma survivors, people actually don't need other people to save them. They need people to walk with them, to accompany them, to support them when they need it. And so many people, including youth, are very resilient naturally. And they oftentimes are able to find their own pathway towards healing with just a little guidance and support here and there.
I love that.
Just gives me so much hope. Yeah.
Yeah. And it also gives me, like, how do I say this? Like, it takes the pressure off me as a youth pastor, because there's times when, like, I don't know what to say. I mean, I've gone through pain, but this is a different kind of pain. I mean, pain is pain, sure, but I don't know what it's like to go through, blank. And all I can be is just to be there and listen and empathize as much as I can. And so thank you. That kind of gives me permission to free myself from always having an answer.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Dave, this has been a great conversation so far, and we've just barely touched the tip of the iceberg. And there's so much more great information in the resource Scars. So for our listeners who have not watched the resource videos, can you give us like a little teaser by telling us what you think is one of the most important insights in Scars?
Sure thing. And I definitely want to encourage all of you guys to check out that resource. It's a great resource developed by UYWI. And so Scars, as you guys mentioned earlier, is a faith-based video curriculum that is designed to teach youth and youth leaders about trauma. So we're addressing questions like, how do you understand what trauma is? How do you make sense of trauma? How do you heal from it? How do you draw upon the rich resources of our Christian faith in our journey of recovery? And one of the most important insights from Scars is that trauma is everywhere, not only in our world, but trauma is everywhere throughout Scripture. It's also everywhere throughout the history of the people of God. So you're not alone. And I would even add that our entire faith is actually built upon a trauma, the trauma of Christ's death on the cross. And even after Jesus resurrected from the dead, the scars, the remnants of the trauma, they still persist. So if you remember when Jesus talked to doubting Thomas after he resurrected from the dead, he invited Thomas to see and to touch the wounds that are still on his hands from his trauma, so that even after Jesus resurrected from the dead, he still carried the memory, he still carried the physical scars from the trauma of the cross. And you even are reminded in the book of Revelation that when we're all with Jesus and he's at the center, Jesus is still described as the Lamb who was slain. So trauma is not something that's meant to be forgotten, and that's okay if you haven't forgotten it. And I think the reason why this is such an important insight is because I feel like so many of us have this expectation that if we're good enough Christians, if we trust Jesus enough, if Jesus Christ has healed us from our emotional wounds, that all this trauma is going to just magically disappear, and we're going to forget what's happened, and we can just move on with life as if nothing happened. And what ends up happening is that people blame themselves when they find that they're still struggling with the consequences or the implications or the aftermath of the trauma. When they're still navigating the many long-term implications of the trauma, they end up blaming themselves. But I think Jesus models a different way for us. We don't have to run away from the memories of the trauma or sugarcoat them and over spiritualize them. That Christ can actually give us the courage to confront and to face these memories, and that God can hold our trauma because he knows what it's like to survive trauma here on earth, and he still remembers his as well. And it reminds me of Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 to 16, which reminds us that we don't have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one that's been tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet he didn't sin. So therefore, let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we can receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need, including our needs related to trauma.
Yeah. Sometimes our students also face trauma that we as youth leaders are not equipped to handle. So how can we get our students the professional help that they might need?
Yeah. I think the first thing that I would say is, especially for those of us who have our own trauma histories or are on our own journey of recovery, one of the most helpful things we can do as youth leaders is to model us prioritizing our mental health. Model as a leader things like rest and care. And related to your question more directly, if we ourselves need to go see a therapist, for us to model going to therapy ourselves. I know one of the greatest hindrances to people receiving help, especially professional help, has to do with stigma. And in the Christian communities that I've ministered to in the past, a lot of times questions that people ask include questions like, well, can I still be a good Christian and see a counselor? Does that mean I'm not trusting Jesus enough? And I think relatedly, leaders are probably asking, can I still be a good leader if I see a counselor? And I think the answer to both questions is yes. We can model that and break through some of that stigma for our youth. And, the second half of this, though, to my answer to your question, though, is I'm afraid I don't know if I have a good answer for it. I think outside of the mental health professionals that might be at our church and within our church network, I don't know if there is this large scale resource that connects churches with mental health professionals. And I believe we need to build something like that. And that's why a lot of my work currently and moving forward is focused on mobilizing churches and mental health professionals to partner together to meet the mental health needs of our youth and our communities. And in fact, one of the research grants I'm overseeing is generously funded by the Lilly Foundation and their Thriving Congregations initiatives. We're partnering with a nonprofit organization called Alliance for Greater Works, and we're developing trauma-informed ministry resources with a network of about 30 to 40 African-American churches throughout the state of Texas. And part of our goal is to build a network of churches and Christian mental health professionals to overcome these barriers of access, and to also develop more resources such as SCARS so that it can be included in our curriculum and in the process of discipling these youth. We can talk about mental health, we can talk about trauma, and we can do it in a faith-informed way. And I would even add, we can do it in a culturally congruent way as well, because each culture, we all have our scars as it relates to historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. Especially many of us here in the United States that come from immigrant families. A lot of our families are here in America because they were fleeing trauma from our country of origin. And then the immigration process was traumatic itself. And as many of us know, a lot of the system here in the United States was not created for people that look like us. And trying to find a life and build a life here can also be traumatic as well. So there's trauma through so much of our history.
Yeah, thanks so much for mentioning that. As you were saying that, I was thinking of different cultures have different perspectives on trauma and what it could mean and how accepting they are of it. I mean, of therapy and how accepting they are of it. And so it's so important to also be aware of those things, to be able to know how to approach either the student and or the parents when we see a student that's struggling with something, or they've confided in us with something, and we need to get them more help that we can't provide.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we can have a whole entire separate conversation on intergenerational trauma and cultural trauma. But, I'll just share one more tidbit as, the older generations who had to live through a lot of that trauma, a lot of them never talk about it, but for, the younger generations, we still feel the effects. We just don't necessarily know. We're only familiar with the trauma that we see in front of us, but we also carry the trauma that got passed down to us. And a lot of times we don't know the details of that because the older generations understandably aren't willing to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, now you're reading my diary. This is not what I signed up for. Well, Dave, we are so grateful that you were with us today. And we end each episode this season with a very practical idea around something that helps us care for ourselves as leaders. And as humans, as people who are not perfect and have gone through so much and will experience so many things. Since today we talked about trauma, how about we share a practice that can help us when we have experienced trauma, or making space for volunteers or other leaders in our ministry who have experienced trauma.
So when I think about trauma and trauma-informed ministry, trauma-informed care, from a theological perspective, at least here in America, I think of the unfortunate reality that so many of us, Christian communities, we've lost touch with the biblical language of grief and lament. And we focus so much on the celebration and the praise and the triumph. And to be fair, those are important parts of our faith. But unfortunately, what ends up happening is it's really easy for us to equate just being positive and being encouraging with being Christian. And that's simply not true. There's a researcher by the name of Glenn Pemberton. He did some research on lament in the Psalms, and he found that the vast majority, somewhere around 70 to 80% of all the Psalms in Scripture are Psalms of lament. And he compared that with the top 100 most popular worship songs that we sing here in the United States. And he found that less than 5% of the songs we sing can potentially qualify as lament. And I think as a result, we've lost so much of this biblical language to express and make sense of our life experiences. So much so that I've encountered and had conversations with too many Christians who are also trauma survivors, and they believe deeply that because their life isn't this constant narrative of celebration and praise and victory to victory and triumph, and it's not all happy endings, and because of that, they feel like their story doesn't belong in the Christian narrative, that perhaps their story is not Christian. There's something wrong with them. And what resources like Scars and our conversation I'm hoping is going to point out is it's actually exactly the opposite. You're actually part of the norm of most of the stories of Scripture, all the way to Jesus. So in light of this, as one of the pastors of our church in One Life City Church in Fullerton, we have started an annual tradition during Lent. In the weeks leading up to Easter, we practice a whole series of Sundays teaching and modeling lament with each other. So over the last few years, we've hosted panels where we invited different congregation members to share about longstanding and current sources of hurt and pain. We try our best not to try to sugarcoat or to try to, find some kind of happy ending at the end, because we invite people to share about longstanding hurts. And in the early stages, when we first were introducing this practice of lament to our church, we invited our church to separate into small groups of maybe 3 or 4. And we invited one person, if they felt comfortable doing this, to share a source of long-term pain that isn't going to get resolved anytime soon. And then we asked the rest of them to just listen and to bear witness, and to try not to try to say something to fix it. And boy, that people were telling me that was so hard to do. People wanted to drop Bible verses. People wanted to say something to make people feel better, to kind of bring resolution to something that hasn't been resolved yet. We need to give our churches and our Christian communities opportunities to develop this capacity to hold tension in the long run, so that we can actually accompany each other in the long run without expecting that all of our troubles are going to be magically resolved in 30 minutes after a sermon, or after we just understand something from scripture. We can understand those things and still take hold of them, and we can still hold our pain that perhaps isn't meant to be extinguished until Christ returns.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Everyone that is listening, we hope this has been a helpful conversation for you. You can dive deeper into trauma-informed discipleship and watch the SCARS videos, which are great. They are so informative, bring different perspectives, so biblically and theologically founded, and I just cannot say enough great things about it. You can find them at UYWI.org. And yeah, Dave, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Dave.
Sure thing. Super glad and grateful to be here. What a wonderful conversation.
Don't forget to take a look at the show notes page. Resources mentioned in the episode are linked for you at fulleryouthinstitute.org/podcast. And be sure to check out the faith-based video curriculum, SCARS. You can even get the curriculum for free. UYWI is making it accessible to all youth ministries. This is our last episode of the season, and we're going to model what we've been talking about this season. We're taking a break. As most of our guests have said this season, we youth leaders are human, we are finite, and that is okay. We may have some bonus episodes this summer, but we'll definitely be back in the fall with another season. We will end the episode with one more short clip from Jenna, a youth leader you've heard from a few times this season. But first, here are this season's credits. The FYI on Youth Ministry is produced by Nika Halula and Roslyn Hernández and edited by Nika Halula, with editorial support from Rachel Dodd and Brad Griffin. Our executive director is Dr. Kara Powell. Design and art direction from Macy Davis and John Kwok. Marketing and social media support from Emily Chu and Maya Hall. We want to do a special shout out to Emily. This was her last season with FYI for now, and we are so grateful for her social media and marketing guidance this past year. Thanks, Emily. Special thanks to our guest today, Dr. David Wang. You can find out more about David and every guest we have on the show by heading over to fulleryouthinstitute.org/podcast. Thanks to the youth leaders this season, Gonzalo, Cole, Matt, Kathy, and Jenna. And thank you for listening. Now we'll hear one more word from Jenna.
I think there's been a destigmatization of therapy, both in the church community as well as in some of my friends from college and such. I think there's this culture of, yes, go to therapy if you have the time and resources for it. And so feeling that validation to seek help, to invest in is my resilience as a leader and as a person. Yes, once I started counseling and doing spiritual direction, I think that helped me be a better leader because I was more aware of what I was bringing into the ministry space, and also setting some healthier boundaries around what was for me to do and what wasn't for me to do too.